Jake, man, it's an honor to have you on the show, man. It's also been great just building a relationship with you over the past couple of years, getting to watch your journey from afar, and looking forward to diving into some of the details of Gemini Sports. But I want to start with the inception story because every founder has one. So kind of talk about what made you want to start this company. What was that like, and then what were some of the gaps that you saw in the sports and analytics space?
Yeah, first, Malcolm, let me say it's a real pleasure, and it's always great to say I'm a fan of your work with anyone that you're talking to because your LinkedIn and kind of everywhere that you're sharing content is a must read. So I'm really excited that you've started a podcast, and it's a pleasure to be on it. Gemini Sports was born out of my experiences working in elite sports for 9 years. So I was a practitioner, a high performance guy. And when I was doing my doctorate in New Zealand, working with the All Blacks rugby teams for the 2016 Olympic Games, I had to learn three coding languages to process sprinting data, and it was awful, and I was awful at it. And so I said, someone's got to make this easier. I had a couple of fundamental beliefs. One is that not everyone should have to learn how to code, and the second was that real executives, real practitioners, decision makers at organizations should not be helplessly reliant on others, no matter how clever they are, to answer their own questions, right? If we all think back to Moneyball, and we could really call Gemini Moneyball in a box, Brad Pitt's character talks to Jonah Hill's character every time they have a question. I think that's too slow for 2025, right? That film takes place more than 20 years ago. So really, I sought to close that gap. And it's not to eliminate any of the brilliant engineers that work for sports teams, but it's to allow them to focus on what they do best and allow the decision makers to answer their own questions. So to me, there was a gap where there were a lot of folks from services through to big SaaS platforms trying to help people be very clever with numbers, but nobody trying to actually build a single source of truth or provide an excellent user experience. And in an age where my 68-year-old mother can use ChatGPT for her work, we have to be able to provide excellent user experiences.
For sure. Well, walk me through this because, like, obviously, you can have an idea, you can have something in your mind that you think, is an actual business and has, potential. But was there like a specific moment that made you realize like this is an actual scalable business, can be venture backed, and has some long term like staying power?
Yeah, I think the moment I knew I had to make a business was when I was consulting with the Houston Astros a lot across 2018, 2019, and I saw maybe the most impressive analytics group in world sport still have a ton of silos and frustrating time to value for their stakeholders. I realized the value of that single source of truth and that user experience, but I don't mind sharing. Look, it took me 2.5 years to work up the courage to just go full time on the idea. 42 rejections from venture capitalists before I was able to move beyond angel investors who essentially were just paying my rent into actually a funded business where I can hire engineers. A year of just hiring initial engineers and whatever we made, it was not resonating with people. A year then of building completely the wrong thing, and raising enough to keep doing it. And then finally figuring out what the right thing was, building it, and now being in the go-to-market with that, and closing in on the gold sticker of product market fit. So it took a while.
A lot of people don't talk about that, man. It's like those years of you trying to figure out how you can turn this into reality. Like I think that's like the true testament of a founder and someone who actually can build something successfully. What was your mentality throughout that process? Like, was there any point in time where you felt like this is just not working? Like, was there any self doubt throughout that journey or 2.5 years of iterating and trying to figure out product market fit?
At least a few times a day. And I think I sometimes I talk to friends who are practitioners or were practitioner friends of mine in the sports sciences, and they'll ask, wow, how do you figure out how to do all these different things involved in running a business? And of course, I've had some unbelievable mentors and advisors along the journey, but really I just figured it out. And I often say that there is no genius required to start and run a business, I don't think I have any besides maybe the ability to get great people in a room together. All that entrepreneurship requires is incredible stubbornness and a very high pain tolerance.
I love that. Let's get into the weeds a little bit. Obviously you guys are a B2B platform. You sell into teams and sports organizations. What are some of your ideologies or best practices around that? Because obviously it's a different market from, maybe financial services or healthcare. Like, how do you kind of approach selling into teams and building those relationships?
So how do I approach the business strategies in B2B in sports?
Correct. Yep.
Yeah, it's an important question because there's obviously a brutal sales cycle in sports, and selling into sports teams is incredibly difficult. The flip side of that is that if you can figure it out, you've got a huge advantage. I think the first thing I should mention that took me way too long to figure out is that founder-led sales are the only way when you're pre-product market fit. I had up to, depending on how you count it, 3 salespeople at one point, and just moved on from them all, not because they weren't good at their jobs, but because no general manager of a sports team or sporting director or even scout wants to buy something that they've never heard of or never thought about how they could use from a salesperson or from anyone other than the crazy person who had the idea. So founder-led sales is the only way, in my opinion. It doesn't mean it's intelligent resourcing, but it is, I think, the only method that will work when you're pre-product market fit. The other thing is I think I learned that you really have to constantly hone your messaging, and never ever be satisfied with it, because every time I think, wow, that's a great line, that makes total sense, someone will tell me that they don't get it, or someone will ask a question that I thought I answered long ago. And within that, I think it's just an absolutely essential assumption that people don't know everything that you want them to know about your offering, how it works, how they onboard, how they're going to get value out of it, who should be using it, or how they should be using it. You might think you've drilled that, but you haven't. And so really making no assumptions on that information transfer is another thing that I found successful. I think finally it's just recognizing that it's just one man's opinion, but as much as I want to be product led, as much as I think that if you come up with the right product, people are going to buy it, I think that sports are I'll say distribution led industry. I don't want to say sales led because I think marketing is essential. So I think it's a distribution led industry. Customer success is simultaneously essential and also very poor in sports. So if you jump over that low bar, you will get huge loyalty and tremendous referrals. So I think it's important to recognize it if you're B2B in sports that don't think you can just build the right product and then people are going to fall all over themselves to buy it. They might not even know that you exist. And within that, a big realization I've had recently is that people don't just look at your product and decide, do I want this? Is this good enough? Would I use it? Those are secondary and tertiary thoughts. The first things that they're probably wondering are, what does this replace? Whose budget should this come from? How does this change the way the value of my role is received and understood? And who might look bad by replacing the product that they brought in order to bring your product in? And all of those factors are massive, and nobody's going to figure that out for you on the customer side. Nobody's going to architect that and then just solve for it. You have to be the shepherd.
Really good insight. So with that in mind, like, who's kind of the sweet spot customer for you guys at the moment? Like, obviously you work with various sports and tiers or levels of organization and scale, but what would be like the perfect organization for Gemini Sports and where you guys are at today?
Yeah, it's a funny one because I think the biggest organizations in the world are learning the hard way that building, in-house solutions for scouting and player trading is not the best use of resources. I've talked to absolute household name soccer teams who say that they've spent 3 million plus on building internal applications that nobody uses, and that they're just hemorrhaging on maintenance costs. And they need something a little more off the shelf. I appreciate everyone wants customization, everyone wants their own IP, but it's not so simple on the product front. At the same time, organizations who all of their player trading decisions come from inbound agent relationships, and really things that don't rely on, let's say, a professionalized scouting and data-led process, those also aren't a fit for us. So it's a large sweet spot, but what I'd say we're currently thriving with, and if you interview me in 6 more months, I might have a very different answer. But what we're finding a lot of success in is like these medium-sized teams that have started to do some great stuff, but they realize that they can't do it alone, and they're staring in the face 5 more hires that they haven't budgeted for. And if they can buy a product that allows them to roll with a smaller staff on the scouting front, then they can get a lot more out of them.
I'm curious, like how you think about pricing, or how did you think about pricing when you were starting the company? Because I think that's one of the hardest things for especially B2B founders is like pricing your product accordingly. It is an art and a science. And you want to make sure you're pricing at a point where you can stay competitive and actually be able to reinvest back into the business and et cetera. So what was your thinking process around that when you were getting a company started, and then how has that evolved over time?
Fantastic. Great timed question because we have been thinking about this a lot and changing this a lot. So in the beginning, I thought I could just give marginal discounts from what I'm hoping our eventual ACV, average contract value, will be, and people would just say, "Oh, that's a great deal," and sign right up. And what I realized pretty recently, actually, is that pricing was a big, big roadblock for us. And I don't even know if it's because people won't see or don't yet see the value of something like what we do, but I don't think that the organizations at large have a concept of just how much this stuff costs in the real business world. And if they're comparing it to lesser options, even partial options, things that solve a third of what you do, but if they cost a tenth as much, it's really hard for them to go and justify the cost. And so they're already sticking their neck out to go with something completely new, to roll with you. So you're asking too much of them. So we've brought our pricing down dramatically recently. And I've gone from, frankly, being very frustrated with our go-to-market to wondering if we can handle the customer success load. And I think that kind of ego death is an important part of the journey. I don't know if other founders are having this experience, but with B2B in sport, most investors really beat us up in the investment process around the TAM and the market size. Now, I have some very good investors and friends who say anyone who doesn't understand that the TAM of sports is plenty big enough just isn't paying attention to the world outside of North America. But it is a topic that comes up, and a question of, can you get high enough prices out of sports teams? There is a horrible race to the bottom among products in the sports world. And I think we're all harming each other through that. You see that where everyone just wants to get in. They want to get a deal. They want to get the logo. They want to get the press release. So it's a big, big, big problem in sports. Everyone wants a discount. Everyone wants a free trial. But I think teams are seeing that you get what you pay for on both ends of the spectrum, and that genuine enterprise grade products that are going to help them do what they do better and help them make, asset trading decisions that are worth tens of millions might require a 6-figure investment. So long story longer, I think I've just realized that it might take a couple of years to get to where you're trying to go. And you need investors that understand that and aren't pressuring you to hit some dream ACV in year 1 or year 2.
For sure. For sure. It's really good insight. Is there like a specific case study or like real world example that comes to mind for like how organizations are using Gemini Sports, and even more so like how you realize like your product is actually making a difference for these teams? Like are there any specific teams that come to mind when you think about what your product is doing to help drive results for the organization?
Yeah, the bad news is most of our customers want that stuff to stay, confidential for the first
Yeah.
couple of years. The good news is there's a couple examples I can share, anonymously. So there's a Premier League team that we signed at the very end of last year, and we actually onboarded them December 22nd, and all 4 players that they bought in the January transfer window, so in that next 5 weeks, were managed through our application. That's not to say they never heard of those players, never looked at them before, but they managed the process through our application. And one of those signings was a last minute pivot that they weren't expecting to sell a player that they now needed to replace, and they had to find something very specific that they hadn't looked at all. And that's something, at least in soccer, you hear quite commonly, but it happens in North American sports too, that you make a trade you weren't expecting to have on your plate, and then all of a sudden you need to replace that player, and you weren't planning for it. You weren't scouting that option. So they were able to move very quickly. And I think ultimately what we're selling is speed and speed and accuracy of decisions. And so that team was able to have a great January transfer window and set them up for the year ahead. Another example is a staff that decided that they wanted to cut their scouting staff in half, and roll with a more tech heavy approach. And there were a lot of nervous folks in the room about that one for sure. What I found is that they were able to do a lot more with the small group because they were actually communicating with each other. There weren't information silos, and everybody was on the same page without having to bother one another. So for me, what I found is that kind of communication pathway is what we're really helping teams with. I think any consultant can generate an athletic article about how they helped a team find a young prospect in a very hipster market. But I think creating a sustainable and robust process within an organization is not as easy. And that's what we do.
That's a great insight. Getting back to some of the internal practices for Gemini, because you mentioned having to let go of salespeople, and firing is, very unfortunate part of a CEO's job. But it's decisions like that that you have to make being in that role. So, can you talk about some of your ideologies, philosophies around culture and team building as the company grows and scales?
It's funny, Malcolm. Sometimes I think to myself, if I ever had to write a book about my learnings, what would be my key pieces of advice? And I often laugh just thinking I couldn't write it because it's all the advice that we've read. It's all the things we've seen 100 times. You just have to learn those lessons yourself. And one of those is hire slow, fire fast. And everyone thinks that they get it, and then they're in a situation and they're not following that. If you think maybe you should move on from someone, you probably should have a couple of weeks ago or months ago. And if you're not sure about if you should hire someone, you are really better off not hiring that role now. It's so easy to think you just can't survive without a certain role, but you can. And wow, have I learned this the hard way, but you can run your company so much leaner than you think you can. I think fewer people that are hungry and dedicated can get so much more done than more people that are maybe a little complacent. And, I think when companies hire really fast after raising a big round, people just think that they're there for a party. And that's not to say that folks aren't working hard and aren't mission driven, but when you're lean, when you're all feeling a shared sense of urgency, and there's just not that many different people you'd have to contact for anything you're trying to solve, something magical happens and you move much faster. So I'd say a relatively recent philosophy is just to run very lean, and maybe run with one or two fewer people than you think you need rather than one or two more. Another thing is, I think a lot of people like to talk about or read the book Radical Candor and say that they're going to communicate really directly. Very few people actually have thick enough skin to operate that way. And so it's just a management practice that I attempt. I'm not going to say I pull it off perfectly, but I think people get so much more done when they can just share their needs and their takes on things and move and win, rather than trying to think of how to say something so that they won't upset people. I recently finally read Walter Isaacson's biography of Elon Musk, and I thought they over-indexed talking about the kind of Asperger's nature of his communication and leadership style. But I was really struck by the narrative around how he might not be the easiest person to work with or the most loved person in his organizations, but he wins and he gets a lot done. And part of that is because he communicates what he needs and nothing more. And so I think it's a very useful approach, maybe not in the long run, but in the short term when you're in that sprint of early stage and you just need to get stuff done and you just need to solve problems. So I think it's extremely important to have people aboard who can work in that way.
I love it. I love it. Last few questions before we wrap up, man. Obviously, you've raised a significant amount of capital, which kudos to you because a lot of founders struggle with fundraising. Uh, what advice would you give another sports tech founder on how to navigate this space and eventually, essentially raise capital in an industry that's still fragmented, that's still growing?
Yeah, I think sports tech is an awful industry to raise money in, especially B2B. I think it's a lot better than it was 3 years ago. There's some great investors out there, and more by the day. And I actually learned about most of them from you. But I think the first thing is really distill the information your investors need to learn about your business. I am so constantly guilty of thinking I need to explain every point that I've got, and if they don't know this context, they're not going to get it. Seriously, every investor wants to know, how do you make money? How am I going to get my return? How big is that return going to be? And why are you the person to do it? I'm probably missing a few things, but start with those four, and make sure that a 15-year-old could figure that out from reading your deck and hearing your 10-minute pitch. And like nothing else matters until you can cover that. So I think that that's extremely important, because people will get lost. They'll get fixated on weird details. They'll only read half your deck. You have to make sure that people know those four things. The other thing is, warm introductions are worth everything. So getting an analyst at a firm to answer you because you emailed them 15 times is not as good as doing whatever work required those 15 emails or whatever to get one warm intro to the partner. No offense to all the analysts and associates out there. They have to make up their numbers, get to a partner. It changes everything. And if anyone wants to meet any of our investors, I'm happy to chat. I think they're wonderful, and they will take a look at anything if it's good. I think the other thing is, recognize that every investor has their thesis. When I was first raising, so many of the sports tech investors that we thought would be a perfect fit only want to look at B2C. They might not even admit that, but they're, a lot of, and I'm using air quotes here, sports tech investors are really investing in like sports adjacent products, fan sided products, consumer products. As I said, being on the like operation side of sports in a B2B setting is kind of a rarity for this industry. And so a lot of investors just aren't comfortable going in that direction. So you have to really spell it out for them. And even for anyone in the sports tech space, I think you have to recognize that every investor will have their thesis on NIL. They'll have their thesis on fan engagement. They'll have their thesis on betting. And you might just not fit into that. And it has nothing to do with you. So recognize that the reasons people are going to pass on you are so varied, so varied. And you might think an investor's perfect for you, and they just aren't right now. So don't take it personally. But I'd also caution, like, that's going to change. People will change their minds on stuff all the time. So while you should definitely push to solicit feedback from rejections that you do get, that might change in 3 or 6 months. So I know everyone says keep those who passed on you updated. And you think, yeah, with what time? But set up some kind of automation, some kind of newsletter, some kind of quarterly check-in, because there are investors I've landed who we have a very big investor who talked to us at pre-seed, goes to me after the second call, didn't answer at least 7 or 8 follow-up emails over the next 18 months. And I absolutely love working with them now. They put in a huge check. They're fantastic. I have a relationship with all the partners. Like, that's just the game. So don't take it personally and keep pushing.
That's great, man. Really great advice. Last question. 5 years from now, what does success look like for Gemini Sports?
We will have exited for a number that I have in my head. And I'll 5 years from now maybe be finishing up, a year or two with the acquiring group, and starting a family, maybe in Brazil, where my wife's from. Miami will always be home. But no, I mean, look, about the company, we want to take over soccer, and be the go-to squad planning and player trading platform, and then move into college football and college sports and North American sports, and then expand into some of the weird international sports that I love, like rugby and cricket. So I think really taking over that squad planning and player trading space is top of mind. I think that there's so much else out there to be conquered in terms of how front offices operate. And I think that they need a high tech, user experience oriented partner. And I think that we're there to provide that.
Jake, man, this has been incredible. Love your insights, love your clarity and vision. Lastly, can you let people know where they can learn more about you and also Gemini Sports?
Yeah, I appreciate you asking. So I started Twitter before I knew that you needed to have a really generic name. And I'm a huge fan of Paul Newman in the film Cool Hand Luke. So my Twitter handle is actually Cool Hand Jake GS. Those are my initials. You can find my company at Gemini_Sports. And we're on LinkedIn a lot as well. And let me just say a final word to any founders, like, just keep going.
That's what it's about, man. Jake, thank you so much, man. It's been great.
Thank you, Malcolm.